All right. Thank you for joining us today. I am really excited to do this webinar for a number of reasons. One, the topic of zero trust, the topic of unmanageable applications, but mostly because I get to chat with my good friend, John Kindervag. John, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Matt.
Awesome. Awesome. So, most of you, I think most of you probably know this already about John, but John is the creator of zero trust. And this is now the topic that everybody's talking about. If you were at RSA, this zero trust was plastered all over the place. Slowly, though, I see AI creeping up on it, but zero trust was the main topic that everyone was talking about. And so John and I have known each other for a number of years, going back to our time at Palo Alto Networks. And so we're former colleagues at Palo Alto. The thing that I love about John is, John has a background, and we'll talk a little bit about this from his time at Forrester as an analyst. A lot of analysts just stay in theory. John is not just about theory. John has spent years helping customers deploy zero trust. And we loved inviting him on to our advisory board a little bit earlier this year. So he's also an advisor for Cerby. So we're going to talk about, obviously, zero trust, what unmanageable applications are. And what I wanted to start with is just to give everyone a brief primer on what unmanageable applications are, or you might hear me also use the term non-federated applications. So I want to do a brief primer on that, and then we'll start to delve a little bit more deeply into zero trust and how those two topics come together. We've did some research quite recently with the Ponemon Institute. And for those of you familiar with Dr. Larry Ponemon, very well known in the industry for doing IBM's cost of a data breach report and numerous other pieces of research throughout the industry. One of the things that we did recently with them is commission research specifically around non-federated applications. And what you're looking at here on your screen right now is really one of the headline pieces that came out, and that 1 in 7 breaches are from applications that you can't manage with your identity provider. Now, we've used the term non-federated applications or unmanageable applications. So let's put a fine point around what we mean. That way, as we kind of go through the talk, everyone's on the same page. Non-federated applications or unmanageable applications, we define them as any application that lacks support for common security and identity standards like SAML, single sign-on, or that lacks APIs to do security posture management. Now, one of the things that I often get asked around this topic is, well, this whole category of applications, unmanageable applications, is it just SaaS? Is it just in the cloud? And the answer is no, right? You can have unmanageable applications anywhere. It could be OT, it could be on-prem, it could be in the cloud. And as if you look at these here, these are mostly SaaS applications. But what I want you to take away is that they fall across all different categories of applications. They can live on-prem and they can live in the cloud. Now, I alluded to some of the research, and we're just going to touch on really just 4 points. And then I want to bring John in to really look at this from a zero trust perspective. Now, there's a couple key findings. We wanted to look at the severity or just the number and try to quantify how large is this problem? How large is the problem of non-federated applications in the enterprise? And so we spoke with over 600 enterprise security professionals. And what we found is that the median number of non-federated applications is 176. So there's some that, have over 1,000. There are some that are on the smaller side that have, a couple dozen of these apps, but the median right down the middle is 176. In terms of staffing costs, because what people often forget about non-federated applications is that there is a large manual effort that goes into onboarding and offboarding access, because you can't do it with your identity provider. And so what we found is that there is a hard cost of around $1,000 in staffing costs to onboard manually onboard and offboard an employee or a third party to a group of non-federated applications. The other thing that stood out in the research was when we looked at, well, who's managing this access? Again, remember, when you have a non-federated app, you can't manage it from your identity provider. So whether it's an Okta, an Azure AD, Ping, whatever it might be, you can't manage it there because the app itself does not support being managed through an IDP. And so what we found is that the access is not being managed centrally by IT or by security. It's being managed by the business units 63% of the time. And when it comes to cyber risk, this is probably one of the biggest questions that people have, is just how prevalent are breaches? Well, I started out with the 1 in 7. One of the questions we asked was just, have you specifically experienced a breach with a non-federated application? And over half, 52%, said they did. So it is a common occurrence because so many of the security controls around these apps are being done manually. They're not being managed through a central set of controls, that it leads to breaches. Now, John, I want to bring you in here and have you walk us through where zero trust fits in to this. And while you're getting ready to share your slides, back in 2010, you were an analyst at Forrester. I think 2008, somewhere in that time frame, if I get the numbers right. What did you see at that time that led you to develop zero trust? What was the genesis?
Well, I started doing research as soon as I got to Forrester on the broken trust model, the idea that there's trusted and untrusted networks and untrusted and trusted devices and users. I had been a security engineer, security architect, network engineer, pen tester, and I realized at some point that this broken trust model, the idea of trust but verify, which I talked about in this report, this is the original report, No More Chewy Centers, was the problem, right? Once you started trusting, you didn't do any verification. So you saw a lot of things where there was no real security. And if you looked at technology at the time, I used to install a lot of PIX firewalls where you had to define a trust level for each interface, and that would determine policy. And I used to say that the trust level of every interface was 0. And that's actually where zero trust comes from. People get way confused in the weeds and the philosophy. And no, man, it was just simple. I hated the fact that there was no policy for traffic going outbound. And I would try to put it in and they would say, no, don't do that because that's not how it works. I'm like, but if there's no outbound policy, then hackers are going to be able to exfiltrate data. Oh, no, they can't get in. Yes, they can get in. See, I just got in, and I would pen tested it, but it just didn't work. You couldn't, people didn't want to hear that. And in fact, when I wrote this report, it was insane because I was insane. People laughed at me and literally would come up to my face and make fun of me and say, you're an idiot. And, that was kind of the nicest thing I heard. So, I never thought this would go anywhere. So, and then you fast forward 11 years and here's where we are. The president issues an executive order almost exactly 2 years ago, last week, mandating that all federal government agencies move towards adopting zero trust. And if you would have told me in 2010 that 11 years later the president was going to write an executive order on this, I would have told you to, get back in your DeLorean, turn on that flux capacitor and get back up to 88 miles an hour, go back to Hill City, because there's no way this is going to happen. But it did, and in the last 2 years since this executive order has come out, it has changed the dynamics of it. It has changed the incentives. That's what I would say, right? So what has happened? We used to joke early on that zero trust was like Fight Club. The first rule is you don't talk about it. I couldn't get anybody to do a case study with me. I couldn't hardly get anybody to do a talk with me. And so that's where that joke came up with. And now the president of the United States with one document has said, not only is it okay to talk about it, but you better talk about it all the time. And so I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. now talking to federal agencies and federal government entities and militaries and stuff talking about zero trust. So, that's kind of the backstory of how we got to where we are in this. So, probably the best thing to do is give you the concise definition of zero trust. And it looks like this. Zero trust is a strategy designed to stop data breaches and make other cyber attacks unsuccessful by eliminating trust from digital systems. And I want to break this down if I can here, Matt. First of all, strategy, right? We've been focused on tactics, stuff. And I can tell you, someone who in the military commented on LinkedIn, the most important thing John ever brought to cybersecurity is that the idea of bringing strategy and grand strategy into cybersecurity, right? And so it's a strategy designed primarily to stop data breaches. Now, what's data, right? Data is the new oil. I live in Texas, and West Texas crude is the benchmark for oil. And when you take a gallon of crude oil, as you refine it, it gets more valuable. Gasoline, aviation fuel, jet fuel, plastics, carbon fiber, nanotubes, everything. The whole world is based upon oil. But data is what's fueling the modern economy. And like oil, the more it's refined, the more valuable it gets. So my name isn't very valuable. My name plus my phone number provides more value to attackers, the people who are going to buy and sell my name, or advertisers, right? We have two adversaries, advertisers and hackers. And so the more it's refined, the more valuable it gets. So then we have the idea that we're going to stop data breaches. Well, what's a breach? This term is what confuses cybersecurity professionals, because we think a breach is, oh, somebody got into our network, they breached the castle walls, they're looking around. No, that's actually a definition of an intrusion. The term breach has been redefined for us by legal and regulatory entities like GDPR, CCPA, PCI, and they all say that a breach occurs when sensitive or regulated data has been exfiltrated from our networks or systems into the hands of a malicious actor. It's not just about what comes in, it's also about what goes out. So that broken trust model, in a Cisco PIX, the adaptive security algorithm, said, we don't care about what's going out. And I said, that's the thing we have to care about. And so we're going to try to stop. We're designing this system to stop data breaches, but we can make other cyber attacks unsuccessful, right? There's two types of cyber attacks. You know this from our Palo Alto Networks days, that there are successful attacks and unsuccessful attacks. And you want to turn the successful into the unsuccessful. Now, I can't stop the attack from happening because I'd have to be the attacker, right? But I can make sure it's unsuccessful. And this happens all the time. Onto it is a managed services company. We provide zero trust as a service. And we make sure we make things unsuccessful all the time. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story if I can. Last year, we had our first ever successful ransomware attack. It was a pretty small outbreak, but it was very embarrassing because we stopped hundreds of thousands of them a year. But this was the first one that had ever been successful. And it was crazy. We had to call the CISO, who's a friend of mine, and say, hey, we had this ransomware outbreak, and here's where it was, and we contained it, and we're cleaning it up, but we're very sorry this happened, and we're investigating. He says, oh, thank you so much, man. This is the best news I've heard in a long time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And like, why? Why are you excited about having a successful ransomware attack? And he says, well, you don't understand. This is the company that we acquired, and they've been pushing back on our zero trust mandates. And so now I'm going to be able to go to the CEO and force them to do the thing that I've been cajoling them to try to do. And so that's the value, the outcome value. And we do it by eliminating this silly thing called trust from digital systems. And all we're worried about is digital systems. That's the only thing we're talking about as it relates to trust.
I love that. I love it. Now, John, I know that on the previous slide, you glossed over this fact, but this is actually a huge honor, I think, in my view for you, is that you were one of several cybersecurity industry leaders who were invited to contribute to the president's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. It's a long word, NSTAC for short. Their draft on zero trust and trusted identity management. You mentioned that when you first put this idea of the concept of zero trust out there, almost looks like about 13 years ago now, that people laughed at you. But what's happened over the last few years that the federal government is now probably one of the biggest net promoters of zero trust, and why now? Like, was there a confluence of events that kind of brought this to the point where the federal government would put its resources behind this?
Well, an early adopter that I can't really talk about was parts of the federal government that had a lot of influence in cybersecurity. That's the first thing. The second thing is really the sea change, the precipitating event was the OPM data breach. You're familiar with that, right? Where all of our country are the people who had clearances in the federal government had all their stuff stolen, all their data stolen by an adversarial nation state network. And this caught the attention. And I don't think it's not in this deck, but a lot of times I'll talk about the OPM breach because the US Congress, a committee called Oversight and Government Reform, which controls, looks at cybersecurity, came out with a report called The OPM Data Breach, How Our Government Jeopardized Our National Security for More Than a Generation. And they were the first people to call out back in 2016. They wanted OMB to mandate that federal agencies move towards a zero trust IT security model. And so that was the thing. Whoa, look at that. And then I found out, I went to Capitol Hill and I met with the staff of OGR. I met with one of the congressmen on that committee and found out who'd been advocating it inside the federal government, which was like, whoa, really? And so that's what moved it along, right? It took a while. The OMB guidance was issued in 2022, last year. It took 6 years to get through the process. Nothing happens quickly in the federal government, but that was the compelling event that forced everybody to look at it more differently. And you mentioned artificial intelligence or machine learning or whatever we want to call it. I mean, that moves hand in hand with zero trust, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's not like the you can't have them both together. So there's a confluence of events that are making it prime time for zero trust. Now, my goal is to just keep it authentic, help people to understand what it really is versus what, say, vendors are spinning it to be.
Well, I love that, and I think it's a good transition to your next slide on some of the common misconceptions. Why don't we go through those?
Yeah. So the first one is zero trust means making a system trusted, and that's not true, right? Here's a question for you. How much trust should there be in a system called zero trust? Zero. Yeah, it's pretty easy. But people have all these ideas of implicit trust, explicit trust. And then if you do this, I'll turn it from an implicit trust to an explicit trust, and then it'll be a trusted system. And people are in love with this word trust, and it has no meaning. It's what is known as a plastic word, a word that we throw around, but we don't even know what it means. And I could go into a long diatribe on what it means, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. And then zero trust is all about identity. Boy, if we can have identity figured out, yeah, we'll solve all the problems. And no, that's not true. We consume identity in policy and zero trust, right? One of the great identity experts, my good friend Richard Byrd, we were having dinner in Cleveland one time and a couple of years ago, and I said that to him, and it totally blew his mind. He finally understood zero trust when I said that to him. And then zero trust, there are zero trust products. No, there's products that work well in environments based upon what you need to protect. So you can't buy a product that will make you zero trusty, right? You have to have you have to have a strategy, and that strategy determines the products. And then finally, zero trust is complicated. And I will tell you, if you read what a lot of people publish about it, I would think, wow, I'll never be able to do that. It's way too complicated. But you'll see today there's only 9 things that you need to know. There's 4 design principles and there's 5 steps. I was just talking to one of the government's chief software officers, and he was like, wow, it's like, it's a design paradigm, right? It's a repeatable design paradigm. He said it's almost like object-oriented programming for networks. Yeah, it kind of is. And I thought that was an interesting perspective from someone who's not a network or a security guy, but a software guy.
Let me ask you this about, you mentioned strategy at the beginning. I think you said maybe it was somebody in the military who said, one of the biggest things John brought was strategy as part of this. A lot of what's been available and what I often hear cybersecurity leaders talk about is things like the NIST CSF framework. Where does something like a NIST CSF, how does that fit with a concept like zero trust? Like where is there a relationship between the two? I would assume you can do both. But how is one different strategy wise, I guess, is the question.
Well, I think, and in a different, speech that I give, I talk a lot about the strategy, but the NIST stuff is basically tactics, right? You have 4 levels of strategic engagement: grand strategy, what the business is trying to accomplish; strategy, the big idea to get there. Then you have tactics, the stuff that you use. And my mentor, who taught me all this, said everybody confuses strategy and tactics. They think they're being strategic, but they're being tactical. And that's what I would say about the NIST stuff. There's not any strategy at all, right? It's all tactics. It's all stuff. And so we're enamored by stuff, but zero trust was designed to decouple strategy and tactics, because I knew the tactics would change over time, but strategy, you don't want strategy to change very often, unless there's a compelling event that's going to force it. And since there hasn't been strategy, right, all the things we thought were strategic, defense in depth or best of breed or compliance, those things are just tactics stuff, right? Anything that focuses on the technology first is a tactic, right? So you need big ideas, and that's what I tried to bring to it, because there weren't big ideas in cybersecurity, because it's driven by vendors. 100% driven by vendors. You and I were at a vendor. You're at a vendor now. I guess I'm at a vendor too, although I'm a little bit independent of vendor thinking because I provide more of a service. And so, and vendors are important. Vendors create the technology we need to enforce this stuff. But of course, no vendor is really focused on the outcome of the end user organization. You have to be that organization, right? So I would never want anybody to say, well, in the case of today's webinar, I'm a Cerby shop. I would want you to say, I'm a insert name of your own organization shop. And I think that's part of the psyops that that the vendor community did, is they got them to think of themselves as a particular shop, to presuppose them to make a buying decision for a particular technology that may not be the best technology for them, because they were making a decision on the technology before they knew what they were even trying to accomplish from a strategic, and certainly a grand strategic perspective. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I will say to the audience right now, I know I didn't say this at the beginning, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to pop those into the Q&A and I will bring them up. You don't have to wait to the end. So if you have a question, anything that either John and I are talking about that's unclear, or just something you want us to double click on, we've got plenty of time. Feel free to drop those into the Q&A. John, one other question on this, and that is that, when I've given talks on zero trust, one of the biggest questions that I get is the perception that it's too rigid, it won't scale. I'm a multinational company. How is it possible for me to maintain? I know we're gonna look at a Kipling method policy a little later on, but how do that there's this perception that it's too rigid, it's too complicated, zero trust won't scale. Like why is that perception wrong?
Because zero trust is scale free, right? And we're going to see it when we get into the 5-step model. We don't care where we're doing the security, where we're doing the protection. It's all based upon what you're protecting. And so we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's completely scale free. I manage some of the world's largest companies, some of the world's smallest companies. I've designed systems for things that are so massive that it would blow your mind, and the things that are so small you'd say, why are you wasting your time? But everybody deserves to have their data or assets protected. So these are the things that we need to focus on as we move forward.
Awesome.
But Matt, let's talk about this loaded word trust. You know, we can spend a lot of time talking about it, and traditionally it's been a word that's been associated with religion or philosophy, and only recently has it ever been involved in business. But what is trust? And I will tell you, and I hope you agree with me, that it's a human emotion, right? Trust is a human emotion. It's not a tangible thing. You can't hold it. You can't pick it up. So it's a human emotion that's been injected into digital systems for no reason at all. And because of this, it's actually a dangerous vulnerability. Trust is a vulnerability, right? And actually, I didn't know this until I wrote the blog post till after I wrote the blog post at Palo Alto Networks. But years and years ago, a man named Morton Deutsch in 1958, when he was talking about workforce engagement, said, trust is the willingness of one individual to be vulnerable to another individual. That was the definition he gave. Now, I didn't discover that until last year, accidentally, you know, as more and more stuff, research reports, like when we were doing zero trust stuff, that stuff wasn't online. It wasn't in LexisNexis. It wasn't in any of the databases, you know. So it's funny how you see that there was a lot of people realizing that trust was a problem for a long time, but they just didn't, you know. I guess I was the one who got to be the recipient of all of those people who passed before me. So what do you do with vulnerabilities in your organization? You mitigate them. And trust is the most dangerous vulnerability you have, because it's also an exploit at the same time. And so you don't have to create new malware to exploit trust, right? All you have to do is get on the network. And as a former pen tester, I can tell you, you can always get on the network. That's why I quit pen testing and got bored with it, because I got bored with the idea that, oh, I got on the network. Well, the question is, what can I get out of it? Right. And we weren't asking that question. And so I got really bored with pen testing, which is the thing that you're supposed to, you know, like if you're an Uber nerd, you're supposed to want to be a pen tester. And I did for a long time. And then I got bored with it because it didn't solve the fundamental problem. I could always get in. I could grab a banner off a router. I could do this. I could do that. But none of that mattered. None of that was sensitive data. And so I got in, big whoop. And then no one could do anything with the reports that I gave them. They were just too complex. Excuse me. Here's all your vulnerabilities. Well, which one do I fix first? I don't know. You just go for it. And so it's overwhelming to people. And it was a design problem. So ultimately, the only entities who get value from trust are the malicious actors who are going to exploit it, right? I mean, dwell time. We'll talk about that. And while we're sitting here, will you look up what Verizon Data Breach Report said is the current dwell time? Well, because I'll bring that up in a minute. So now let's you know, talk about this, right? Because what we see is there was design paradigms that didn't work. And so we're going to kind of invert that, right? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on the business outcomes. This is how we get into the grand strategy. What is the business trying to achieve? I talk to people all the time who don't know what the business is trying to achieve in their organization, you know, other than keep the lights on, right? But there's strategic security objectives that certainly all public companies have to have now. You're starting to see a lot of cybersecurity people, you know, advise boards, at least. They should be on boards probably, but you're seeing a lot of people. I train board members, and then I hear them come out, no, I'm cybersecurity expert. I'm at this board, and I'm like, well, you spent an hour with me. That's your entire cybersecurity background, but whatever. You know, it's funny how the world works. And then we're going to design the network from the inside out. We're going to start with the data or assets that we need to protect and move outwards from there. You know, we all learned to design networks from the outside in. We started at the edge and moved inward, right? And so we ended up with a bunch of open switch ports, and we said, hey, plug everything in wherever you want it. We don't care. And you know, John Davis, you worked with him when we were at Palo Alto
Remember
Networks,
John?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So John, as one friend of mine said, you call him John? And I said, yeah, isn't that his name? And he said, no, his name is General. So he's a former two-star general, but worked with us for years and stood up what ultimately became Cyber Command originally. And he said to me, this one concept of zero trust is the thing that really made me understand what you were doing. Design from the inside out, because I realized, you know, he was in special operations, ended up in cyber, realized he didn't know anything about it, so just brought over the best people in the military to help him do that. But he said, we were getting it wrong from a design perspective. And if you think about how we did it in the military, we protected the things that were most important. So Greg Tuhill, a former, a retired Air Force general, he's the head of CERT now. He talks, about, he quotes Frederick the Great often in things I do with him. He said, Frederick the Great says, if you try to protect everything, you protect nothing. So you got to figure out from the inside out what you need to protect. And then you need to inspect or determine who or what needs to have access. We give too many people too much access for no reason at all, right? So I joke, it's like if I'm sitting on the couch with my wife and I say, hey, hon, do you know who's getting beer out of the fridge? No, I don't have any idea who that is. Well, I guess they're able to get beer out of the fridge, so they must belong here. So we better make up the guest room. Can you bring me some clean sheets? I'm going to go strip the bed in the guest room. No, we don't do that. But we do that all the time in our networking environments. And then we inspect and log all traffic up through layer 7. You and I understand how important layer 7 is. That's where the attackers live. But we're not typically looking at where the attackers live. We're looking at what's easy for us to see. And we don't have enough of it, visibility, which is why we have things like dwell time. It's not because the attackers are cloaked, as I've heard some people say. It's because we aren't looking. So ultimately, zero trust is a layer 7 policy statement. We just need controls that can enforce those kinds of policy. And so this is the famous Secret Service example. I give this all over the place and people love this. This is the best visual representation of what I'm trying to do. And this is an image from President Barack Obama's 2009 inauguration parade. And there are 3 things that the Secret Service knows about the President of the United States that we don't know about the data or assets we're protecting. First, they know where or who the president is. They don't do presidential discovery projects. They don't scan for the president, do they? No. Secondly, they know where the president is at all times. They never go, hey, Matt, we've lost the president. Have you seen him? Absolutely never happens. And third, they know who should have access to the president at any given time. Next time I see you, I'll tell you a little story about my experience with the Secret Service in an event with Vice President Al Gore years ago, and how that led to this example. But we won't have that discussion online where it's being recorded. So you can see here that, yeah, okay, they had a perimeter on this day. It was January 20th, 2009. But look at this uniformed Secret Service agent. He has his hands in his pockets. Looks like a pretty warm hat on, right? Covering the ears. Coat looks to be zipped up. These people are not ready to protect anything. They're just here to intimidate, knock down the low-hanging fruit. The real protection is being done here at the bottom of the screen at what I call the protect surface. The protect surface is the fundamental concept of zero trust tactically. If you don't understand a protect surface, you will never understand zero trust. It doesn't matter what you do, what technology you will buy, you will never understand it. I don't care about the attack surface anymore. I can shrink the attack surface down orders of magnitude to something very small and easily known called a protect surface. So on this day, there were only 4 people in the protect surface: the president, his wife, and his 2 daughters. That's it. If at the end of the day, those 4 people are left alive, the Secret Service has done their job. If something happens to this person up here, they'll send flowers, but they're not there to protect that person, right? And so that's the cold, hard reality. You got to figure out what you need to protect. And by the way, the beast, this confuses people. The beast is not the protect surface. Again, it shows how we're focused on technology, because sometimes they're in the beast, the limousine, sometimes they're in Marine One, the helicopter, sometimes they're in Air Force One, which is the airplane. Sometimes they're walking a rope line. They're always the protect surface. And because they are the protect surface, we're going to watch the Secret Service do something really, really amazing right now. Here's something really magical. Look at this. They move their controls in adjacent to the thing they're protecting. We don't do this in cybersecurity. Our controls are out here on the endpoint or on the perimeter, which are as far away as we can possibly get them from the thing we're trying to protect. And this creates a secondary attack surface that we call the network, our network, right? And this is where we get the term dwell time, because the attackers are here doing whatever they want to do because there's no visibility between the edge and the thing we're protecting. So what's dwell time right now? Did you look that up?
Looks like, yes. From what I can see, it looks like the average hovers around 85 to 100 days.
85 to 100 days. Well, that's 85 to 100 days too much, right? Dwell time should be zero dwell. Hey, I mean, and you looked at the GoDaddy thing that came out a few weeks ago or a month ago. What was that? 3 years?
Yeah,
3 years.
a long time.
3 years. You know, Citrix 20 years. Nortel, for so long we don't even know. They went out of they were hacked out of business. So we got to get rid of this. And so the Secret Service does this by then creating a micro perimeter in policy enforced by these controls. So the micro perimeter is designed to protect a protect surface, right? And by creating a micro perimeter instead of having a big perimeter, you reduce policy down 7 to 10 times at least. So policy is interesting. Policy is binary. You can only allow or deny something. That's it. You can have multiple criteria on why you do it, but it's only an allow or a deny rule, right? And so in Zero Trust, we start with a deny all, just like they have a deny all in the Secret Service here on this date. So I've eliminated 50% of your decision making. You don't have to think about what you're going to deny. You have to think about what you're going to allow. So you just allow certain things to happen. And this is really important because all bad things happen inside of an allow rule. Let me say this again, in case you didn't hear it. All the bad things that can happen to you happen inside of an allow rule. If there is a bad thing that happens, you have a rule that allowed it to happen. So you're not a victim in the way you think you are. You are a maybe unwitting co-participant in the bad thing, right? So I see a lot of people, oh, we denied something here. In this log, we need to investigate why we denied it. No, give yourself a big high five. We denied something, move on, figure out what you're allowing. That's the secret. If you don't understand that secret, you'll never be successful. So there's a deny all rule at the start of everything. And then they have an allow rule to allow transit outbound of the micro perimeter. These two plainclothes Secret Service agents who are driving the beast right here. They are the only people who can leave because remember the family, they're the protect surface. They're always going to have this micro perimeter around them. So they can never get outside of the micro perimeter ever. Actually, for the rest of their lives, I guess the kids can later on when they get old, but the president and his wife, President Obama and his wife still have Secret Service protection today, right? So that's what you sign up for. So now that's all that can leave. Now, if somebody tries to come in, say, Matt, you were in the audience and you decide, I'm going to come in and I am going to get a really close up picture through the glass here. I'm going to run in here. Well, that would be bad for you, right? Because there is a deny all rule right now where you can see this Secret Service agent, right? Hands aren't in pockets, no gloves, no hat, coat isn't even buttoned because there's a layer 7 to enforce, layer 7 technology that's going to enforce that denial rule right there, right? So if you would have done that on this date, it would have gone down in Shoddy family lore as Matt's really, really, really bad day, right? Huh. You end up in the emergency room or the morgue. And oh, sorry, we didn't. Oh, that was a camera in your hand, right? I mean, they don't take chances. You know that you can't social engineer the Secret Service. I give this speech a lot, and there's a lot of Secret Service agents, and I have a whole collection of Secret Service pins because they like this metaphor so much. But they don't stop there. They continuously monitor and update what's going on in real time. So they're looking out in the crowd. Oh, that's somebody sketchy, a little threat intelligence, that kind of stuff. You're trying to keep an eye on what's happening so that you can inform your policy, or you can get a message from higher up, right? And you can distribute it to the technology, and you can change policy in real time to allow an important person to come in, to the micro perimeter. And so this is a zero trust model of executive protection. And this is how you protect anything, whether it is data, assets, or the president of the United States. It's simple. You start with a thing that you're protecting, right? The president, his family, or data or assets. And once you figure that out, and once you can internalize this image, this helps a lot of people really understand what zero trust is about.
I love it. I love it. Now, I've not ever heard you talk about what this picture is. I've seen this in decks, but I've never actually heard you present on it. So I'm curious to see how you weave this in.
So this is a place called the Fleury Stairs in a fjord, Lysfjord in Norway, near a town called Stavanger. That's where my grandfather grew up. And so I've been to Norway a couple times on business, and I take extended time because I have cousins and stuff there. A lot of Kindervags are still in Norway, and I'm related to probably most of southwestern Norway. If you look back to our genealogy that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so we went out, my cousin and I and my son went out to this island in this big fjord. And the fjord, if you watched Mission Impossible 2, the final helicopter scene of Mission Impossible 2 was filmed in this fjord. They claim it's in Thailand, but it was actually filmed in this fjord. And I guess the new Mission Impossible, a bunch of it was filmed in another fjord north of there. Tom Cruise apparently likes filming in the fjords of Norway because they're so gorgeous. Well, this is an island, and there's a mountain right here, right? And inside this mountain in the early 1900s, by hand, they carved it out, hollowed it out, and built a hydroelectric power plant inside of it, right? So melting snow would pour in, and they'd do hydroelectric power. I mean, Norway is an interesting country in that it's one of the top suppliers of oil in the North Sea. They had this big oil discovery in late 1960s, early 1970s that transformed the economy. But oddly enough, almost 100% of their power comes from hydroelectric. So in the early 1900s, they built this hydroelectric power plant. But in order to hollow it out, they had to build these things called the Fleury Stairs. It's the world's longest wooden staircase, 4,444 steps, right? People come from all over the world to climb these. It's on their bucket list. I'll tell you, Matt, I got up to about here, and then I said, whoa, if I go any farther, I'm going to kick the bucket. So I didn't go all the way to the top. But back in the early 1900s, the workers, they would have to carry 50-kilogram bags of concrete up these stairs, or they'd carry these heavy iron fittings or whatever. Everything had to be hand carried because they hadn't built this trolley yet. And so I was thinking, oh, you don't think about the 4,000th step. You don't think about the 3,000th step. You don't think about the 10th step when you're starting your journey in the morning. You think about the first step and the second step and the third step and the fourth step. And so this is the same way you do zero trust. You start your journey with the first step. And so I created a 5-step methodology a number of years ago that continues to hold true. I looked at maybe the first 30 or 40 zero trust environments that I designed, and I realized there were 5 things that were common to all of them, no matter where they were located, the kind of technology. There were 5 things that I could give you as a set of guiding principles to be successful. So if you adopt this 5-step methodology, you'll be successful. If you don't, your chances of success decrease significantly. So the first thing we're going to do is define the protect surface, right? What do we need to protect? I talk to people all the time. Oh, I bought widget X, gadget Y. What do I do with it? Where do I put it? I don't know. What are you trying to protect? Haven't thought about that yet. Wrong answer, right? So we need to figure out what we need to protect, right? And the answer is called a DAS element. So this is a term that I created a number of years ago to help people easily understand what goes into a zero trust environment. So we talk about data that's sensitive, applications that use sensitive data. That's kind of what we're focused on today. Assets that are sensitive, lots of sensitive assets out there, IT, OT, it doesn't matter. And then services, DNS, DHCP, NTP. How many people protect their network time protocol system? But if that goes down, you're toast, right? And so you take a single DAS element, put it into a single protect surface, and build your protect surface out, your zero trust environment out, one protect surface at a time. And in this way, zero trust becomes 3 things. It becomes incremental, it becomes iterative, and it becomes non-disruptive. So we want to, the most we can screw up is one protect surface at a time. So we're trying to do this in a way that's simple and incremental. If you try to boil the ocean with, if you try to eat the elephant in one bite, you're going to fail. And that's what people are trying to do all the time. That's the biggest failure. That's where it gets complicated. So then once we've done that, we map the transaction flows. We need to understand how the system works together as a system. This is where you can really screw up, because if you don't understand how the system works, you can't protect it, and you will have a high possibility of screwing up this system, because this is a system. Imagine going to a mechanic who doesn't know how all the parts of the car work together as a system. That would be horrible. Yeah, I only understand the mechanical part, not the electrical part. So you're going to have to go to somebody else to work on the electrical part, and you're going to have to somebody else to work on the no, it would be unbelievably difficult to get your car repaired. And so once we understand this will show us what we need to protect and how we protect it. So architecting is the 3rd step. And every zero trust architecture is custom made for the protect surface. I can't tell you what technology to buy until I understand what you're needing to protect. And the 4th step is policy. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And the 5th step is monitor and maintain. This is where we take all the telemetry, we re-inject it back into the system so that we can create a what's known as an anti-fragile system. So if you're familiar with the book Anti-Fragile by Taleb, he gave me the vocabulary to talk about what I was trying to do, which is create a system that gets stronger and stronger over time. So there's certain systems that are robust, a rock, and certain systems that are fragile, like the piece of glass. You throw a rock through a piece of glass, the glass breaks, the rock probably isn't broken. And Taleb created a third system called anti-fragile. That's a system that gets stronger and stronger under load, under stressors. And he gave me the vocabulary to talk about what I wanted zero trust to be. So the more we get information, the more we get stress, the more we get attacks, and when we defend against something, the stronger we can make each protect surface. So zero trust is an anti-fragile system, and people need to understand that's one of the real values. Now, most people start zero trust because they need to do segmentation. I'll say, why are you going to segment your network? And they'll say, well, I had an audit finding that told me that I needed to segment my network. And I say, oh, no. That's the compelling event that's going to force you to segment your network. But the only real reason to segment a network is to protect something, right? So this is why we always start with the protect surface. So let's look at this one. We call this the cardholder data environment for PCI, credit cards in this example. And so PCI is our protect surface, right? And so now, once we do that, we know why we are segmenting. Not so many leaders say, "Oh, I get it. We didn't know why our segmentation project failed because we didn't know why we were doing it." Right? We were doing it to buy the technology, but not to actually protect something. And again, the only reason to segment is to protect something. So once we do that, we can then have a control that I call a segmentation gateway. This is a gateway that segments networks layers 2 through 7 based upon networks, application, or data. And they can be physical segmentation gateways or virtual segmentation gateways. But anything that can do that, NIST calls them policy decision points. No, policy enforcement points. I get those two. Boy, they make it complicated, don't they? But whatever you want to call them. And then once you connect that to the micro perimeter, you now are having a way to enforce the segmentation up at layer 7. And so now with that micro perimeter, right, all I have to do is create centralized management, which is a policy decision point in NIST terminology. Again, they're not very good at marketing and creating terms that resonate, but whatever. So it's the closest I can come to a reference architecture for zero trust. Now, all we're going to do is do this over and over again. So for each protect surface, it becomes incremental, one at a time, iterative, one after another, and then non-disruptive. The most we can screw up is one protect surface at a time. But let's say we wanted to control an unmanageable app or an unfederated app like we're talking about. What if the app was actually, we'll say LinkedIn here, which is a cloud service, but still whatever we want to, well, actually LinkedIn wouldn't exist here. We're going to say LinkedIn is up here, right? LinkedIn is up here. And so now we want to control that. So how are we going to do that in this environment here? Well, this is where you and all my friends at Cerby come in, because by connecting to Cerby, CER, that's a B, not an S. Cerby, right? Cerby can connect into the IDP, the Identity Management Program system, and connect to however the system works with the users. Hopefully they're going across, either they're connecting to a SASE system in some way, they're involved in zero trust, and they're going through a segmentation gateway, because this can be in a SASE environment, in a cloud, it doesn't matter. So now Cerby understands how LinkedIn works. Cerby understands what your identity provider is, and they essentially help define the enforcement and kind of tie in on the back end to make this all work, right? But this could be another good example of what I would consider an unmanageable or non-federated app, or just mainframe type of apps, right? We call this legacy, but I've realized that they're not legacy because they generate money, but they don't have a way to tie into standard identity infrastructure. So in the same way, you can connect all of these things together. So it's about understanding what's the best way to get to where we can enforce policy, because that's the thing we're trying to do. So in the Kipling method, this is who, what, when, where, why, and how. Rudyard Kipling gave us that in a poem in 1902. So it's my personal homage to him. And every culture and every language in the world has this idea of who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so we can use that to ask who should have access via what application, when is optional, right? So we should do more time limited stuff, but we don't. But where is that located? Why are we doing it? Again, an optional field that we use, that we hold open, so that hopefully we'll eventually add data classification, tagging and stuff into it. And then finally, what are we going to do to the packet? How are we going to inspect it? How are we going to look at it to make sure that it's clean, that it should be allowed, so we can turn on things like threat protection or IPS or URL filtering or whatever we want to do to make that happen. So if we take an example of a non-federated app like LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn is the what statement. By what application are we going to allow this? And we have to understand this above port and protocol, right? So we have to go beyond port and protocol, because if we just said open everything at 443, which is really the port that is open for LinkedIn, and there's no protocol inspection being done, because if you were actually doing protocol decodes, you'd be up at layer 7, right? So protocol is just metadata about layer 3. So we say TLS or SSL, they're kind of equivalent. They both run on 443. But if we just open up all of 443, then the attackers are going to encrypt everything in TLS, and then we're not going to know what's going on. So now we know what applications we're going to have. We're going to then say who should be able to get access to that. That's where we say the marketing team is going to use LinkedIn for Business, right? And so we can figure out that's, OU equal marketing maybe, right? But this is where Cerby is going to get this information and tie it into LinkedIn. So, and then say, hey, let's also enforce, multi-factor authentication on this. And so it can enforce that in a way that you couldn't do it natively with the application. So now I know who should be able to access the application via what application are we doing it, right? We know where it's located, right? So we know where LinkedIn is served up, because in this case, it's a SaaS application, and we know where that SaaS is located. And then finally, what are we going to do to look at it? What's the house statement? So we're probably going to put some threat protection on there. And we're not going to need URL filtering, because this rule will never allow the packet to surf the public internet, even though it's traversing the public internet, right? But we will decrypt it to look at what's happening inside the packet. We'll probably turn on some sandboxing. These are Palo Alto Networks terms that are familiar to both Matt and I, but this is sandboxing, right? Because I want to say, whatever you're uploading to LinkedIn, and we do this all the time, is that clean, right? If I take just a simple JPEG and I upload it, and I do this all the time. I mean, I'm not, it's hard to practice what you preach, because the technology isn't easy to use.
For sure.
Right. So, but I'll put a photo into my LinkedIn or something. And in reality, that could be embedded with malware. And so it needs to run through a sandbox. And actually, in my case, because of the company I work for and the technology we use, and we're on a zero trust network, it actually is inspected. But you want to make sure that JPEG, that simple JPEG that you're uploading to, or that PDF or whatever, doesn't have malware embedded in it, because attackers embed malware in all kinds of things. I've seen it embedded in a DICOM file, which is an MRI image. I mean, it's amazing. So if all these things are true, then we're going to allow. Remember, there's almost never a deny rule. Zero trust is a set of granular allow rules. Just turn on this, turn on this, turn on this. Who needs to have access to LinkedIn? And here's the worst case scenario. Oh no, you're limiting, people's ability to get their job done. Hey, if you're supposed to have access to LinkedIn and you don't, as a marketer, you just say, hey, I don't have access. I'm going to open up a ticket. Can you give me access to that? And you get your manager to approve that access. Bada bing, bada boom, you've now got access. It doesn't inhibit your ability to get your job done, except maybe for a few minutes or a day. And we have to be willing to put up with that, because the consequences are so huge. I know of one significant data breach that occurred that's where they said that the S3 bucket was misconfigured. And when you look at the lawsuits, no, the S3 bucket wasn't misconfigured. Somebody said, open this up to everybody who has a domain credential, because we want to accelerate the speed of development. So we're not going to restrict it to anybody, or we're not going to restrict it from anybody. And it's like, that's insanity, right? This is a different threat environment. And so you say, all I care about is availability. Well, but guess what? When there's a data breach, that's what gets CEOs fired.
I love it. I love it. John, this has been some amazing information. I know we're coming up right on the top of the hour. So John, I don't know if your schedule permits to go over a little bit. I know you only have about another maybe slide or two, but for those that do need to drop, don't worry. We will send out a copy of the recording. If you have questions, feel free to send them our way. But John, I'll
No,
let you.
I'll join my last call a couple minutes. I told a couple stories that I don't normally do. Let's talk about where you start, right? So there's this thing called the learning curve, where I built this in the Pentagon, actually, for the military. We look at the sensitivity or criticality of the protect surface versus time, and we start with something that has low sensitivity. And early on, we do what's called a learning protect surface. If you make a mistake, it's like street ball, no harm, no foul, right? And then after that, you're going to focus on something that's a little more sensitive, still not mission critical, and that's called practice protect surfaces. You get to zero trust the same way you get to Carnegie Hall. Practice, practice, practice. Then early on, pretty early in your journey, you'll be able to focus on your crown jewels, your high value assets, your keys to the kingdom. You may not want to start there if you don't fully understand it. Then over time, you'll retrofit other things into there. But of course, everybody gets to define, here's the threshold where stuff isn't sensitive enough to go into zero trust. Not everything should be protected in the same way. And then finally, the last thing is the maturity model, right? How do I measure my progress? And you'll see the CISA maturity model, and I'm actually writing a blog post for the Cloud Security Alliance on how the CISA maturity model works with the zero trust maturity model that I created. And they work actually together. I was just at CISA 2 weeks ago talking to them about this. This came well before the CISA one, by the way. The other one is designed to tell you what technologies you use within a protect surface. But remember, we need to look at everything on a per protect surface basis. So remember, we had the cardholder data environment and the DAS element was PCI. So we're going to be able to say, oh, we know what that protect surface is because there's a thing called a LUN formula that mathematically we can understand that data. The easiest data to discover is credit card data. Thank goodness for the credit card companies doing something like that versus social security numbers, which are just random, right? And then we maybe have, we know how it works a little bit. We have a base control, base policy, a little bit of logging to meet requirement 10. But now I need to get to a place where I get to 20, like in 180 days. So I can have a project called 20 in 180 days to just focus on this one protect surface and make it stronger and stronger. So that's kind of the last thought that I had there, Matt, and thank you for inviting me. But any last questions?
No, I mean, I think that was great. And I think, I guess you did touch on this. It's the last thing I'll ask, and then we'll wrap up the presentation. But you did mention that the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, released their zero trust maturity model. How is it different, maybe in 30, 60 seconds? How is it different from what you're showing here? They talk about traditional, initial, advanced, and optimal. Maybe just give us 60 seconds on that.
Yeah, that's all about the products that you're going to use within each protect surface. So they're looking at these pillars, identity, network, blah, blah, blah. But they're not defining the protect surface. Now, they're all on board with this. And I do a lot of stuff with them and the authors of that. But it's how those things integrate at a technology world, because they're much more looking at technology than strategy. But this confuses a lot of people. So they think they need to fix all identity in their whole company before they can move on to the next thing. And they think they're sequential based upon those pillars, right? And no, none of those things are true. If you have 1,000 systems that you need to work on, and if you get identity fixed on one of those, you get that up to 4, even the most optimal way, and the other 99 are still at 1, your aggregate is 1 for identity. And so people don't understand how those things are designed to integrate. And so that's my next set of messaging, is to talk about that.
I love it. Well, John, we've loved having you on the webinar today. This has been a great learning experience. Again, for those that maybe you had to pop in and out as we were going through this is recorded, and you will get an email from us with a link to both the copy of this webinar, as well as a link to our latest research that I alluded to at the beginning with the Ponemon Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you.